My husband went to the golf club every Friday afternoon for 22 years. Not Saturday mornings when the weather was nice, not Sunday evenings with the neighbors. Friday afternoons, specifically always between 2 and 6. Rain, sleet, a kind of Ohio winter that turns your fingers numb before you reach the car. It didn't matter. He'd put on his khakis, kiss my cheek, and say the same thing every time. You know how the guys are, Nora. They count on me. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? Gerald was a family physician for 38 years. Half of Dayton trusted him with their children's fevers and their mother's heart conditions. He coached Little League for 6 seasons when our son was young. He held my hand in the hospital when my own mother passed. This was not a man who lied. This was not a man who had things to hide. I am 69 years old. I taught high school English for 31 years. I have read every kind of story there is, tragedy, betrayal, redemption, the slow unraveling of things that seem solid. I thought I could recognize a plot twist when it was coming. I was wrong. Gerald collapsed in his office on a Wednesday afternoon in March. His nurse found him slumped over his desk between appointments, his reading glasses still on, a half-eaten sandwich beside him. She called 911 immediately. By the time I got to Miami Valley Hospital, he was in the ICU, breathing with help, unconscious. The neurologist used words like massive hemorrhagic stroke and significant brain injury, and will know more in 48 hours. I sat in a waiting room chair and held my own hands because there was nothing else to hold. Our son drove down from Columbus. Our daughter flew in from Portland. We took turns sitting beside Gerald's bed, talking to him the way the nurses said to, as if he could hear. I told him about the tulips coming up in the front yard. I told him the Henderson's dog had gotten into our trash again. I told him I loved him and that he needed to fight. He died on the 4th day. He never woke up. The grief that came was strange, wide and gray, like fog you can't see the edges of. We buried him on a Saturday and the church was full. 300 people came to the reception. Person after person took my hands and said what good people say at funerals. He was one of a kind. He cared so much. You could always count on Gerald. I nodded and thanked them. I believed it. I had believed it for 41 years. The phone call came 8 days after the funeral. I was in Gerald's home office going through papers the way you have to after someone dies. Insurance documents, account numbers, the slow paperwork of grief. His cell phone was on the desk. I'd been meaning to call the provider to cancel the plan. It rang while I was sitting there, and I picked it up without thinking, the way you do. Gerald? The voice was a woman's. Low, careful. Gerald, please. I just need to know if you're okay. You haven't called in 2 weeks, and This is his wife, I said. The silence on the other end lasted a long time. I'm sorry, she finally said. I think I have the wrong number. She did not have the wrong number. I knew it before she hung up. Something in the quality of that silence, the specific weight of it, told me everything. Her name was Susan. I didn't find that out until later. I spent that night going back through 11 years of phone records on Gerald's laptop. He'd kept the account logged in, which I suppose he never thought would matter. There were hundreds of texts, calls sometimes twice a week, calls on Friday afternoons, always between 2 and 6. I didn't sleep. I sat at his desk in the dark and read until my eyes burned. Her name was Susan Calloway. She was 54 years old, a dental hygienist who worked in Centerville, about 20 minutes from our house. They had been together for 14 years. Not an affair in the way I'd always imagined affairs, frantic and guilty and temporary. 14 years. They had a routine. They had inside jokes I could see in the texts. They had a dog together, a beagle named Rusty, who apparently had a bad hip, and they had a daughter. Her name was Abby. She was 11 years old. I sat with that for a long time. The math was unavoidable. Gerald had been a father to another child for the entirety of our daughter's teenage years. Her college, her wedding, the birth of her 2 sons. He had been a grandfather to our grandchildren and simultaneously a father to someone else's child. He had held both lives in his hands and kept them perfectly separate, and neither Susan nor I had known about the other. In the morning, I called our son. He drove down that same day. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, and I walked him through everything. The phone call, the texts, the name, the timeline. He read the records himself. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Mom, are you sure?" I understood the question. He needed to ask it the same way. You need to check that a door is really locked even when you already know it is. I slid the phone across the table and let him read. His face went through things I'd never seen on it before. He's 40 years old, my son. He coaches his kids' soccer. He's not a man who cries easily. He cried. That afternoon, while he was still there, I called Gerald's financial advisor. Gerald had always handled our investments. "You focus on the English department. I'll focus on the portfolio," he used to say, and I had let him because he was methodical and careful, and I trusted him. The advisor's name was Tom, and he'd managed our accounts for 15 years. Tom went quiet when I told him Gerald had died. Then he said very carefully, "Nora, I think you should come in." I went in the next morning alone. Tom's office was on the 5th floor of a building downtown, glass windows looking out at the river. He had a folder already prepared, which told me he had been waiting for this conversation, or one like it. "Gerald restructured several accounts about 3 years ago," he said, setting the folder in front of me. "I want to be straightforward with you. I had some concerns at the time, but he had power of attorney over the joint investments, and everything he did was technically within his legal authority." I opened the folder. Our retirement accounts should have held roughly $580,000. We've been contributing to them for decades. Gerald had moved $310,000 of that into a separate investment trust. The trust-listed beneficiary was not me. It was Abby Calloway, age 11, and Susan Calloway, age 54, the house we lived in for 33 years, the house where we raised 2 children, where I planted the rose garden, where Gerald built the back porch with his own hands one summer, had a home equity line of credit taken out against it 18 months ago, $180,000. I had not signed those papers. My name is on them. My signature was there. I had not signed them. Tom was watching me with the expression of a man who wished he were somewhere else. "There's more," he said. "There was a life insurance policy. Gerald had updated the beneficiary designation 4 years ago. He hadn't told me. The policy was worth $450,000. Half was designated for me. Half to $25,000 went to Susan Calloway, listed as domestic partner. I closed the folder. I set it on Tom's desk. I stood up and put on my coat. Mrs. Fielding," Tom said. "I'm very sorry. I should have called you when he made those changes. I considered it. I'm sorry I didn't." "Give me the name of a lawyer," I said. "Someone who handles cases like this." He wrote a name on a card. I took it. I walked to my car, sat in the parking garage for about 10 minutes, and then I drove home. Our daughter called that evening. She had always been closer to her father than to me. He was the one who took her to our first concert, who sat with her through her college application essays, who danced with her at her wedding with tears running down his face. I'd expected this call to be the hardest one. "Mom," she said before I could get through the first sentence. "I know." I stopped. "What do you mean you know? About Susan? About Abby?" Her voice was flat in a way I'd never heard from her before. "Dad told me 2 years ago." The room tilted. "He told you?" "He said he was going to come clean. He said he was planning to tell you. He asked me to keep it between us until he figured out how." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "He figured it out, I guess." I didn't say anything for a moment. I was thinking about the last 2 years. Family dinners, Christmas, our grandson's birthday parties, my daughter sitting across from me at the table, knowing. Gerald sitting at the head of that table, knowing. Both of them watching me talk about ordinary things, and both of them carrying this. "Did you know about the money?" I asked. "No. God, no." "What money?" I told her. "The investment trust. The home equity loan with my forged signature. The life insurance split." The silence was different this time. the silence of someone recalibrating everything they thought they understood. "Mom," she finally said, "I didn't know any of that, I swear." "I believe you," I said, and I did. I just wasn't sure it changed very much. The lawyer's name was Patricia Okafor. Her office was in a Victorian house on 5th Street that had been converted to law offices, all dark wood and bookcases. She was 58, direct in the way that good lawyers are direct, and she listened to everything I had to say without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her hands on the desk. "The forged signature on the home equity loan is the most actionable piece," she said. "If we can prove you didn't sign those documents, and a handwriting expert can likely confirm that, the loan itself may be voidable. The investment trust is more complicated. Gerald had legal authority over joint assets. Moving them wasn't necessarily illegal, depending on how it was structured. But designating a non-marital partner as beneficiary while you were still legally married opened several avenues. What about the life insurance? Beneficiary designations are notoriously difficult to contest, but the circumstances here are unusual. He forged her signature on other documents. That establishes a pattern." She looked at me steadily. "This is going to take time, probably a year. And it's going to cost money you may not easily have access to right now." I thought about the $43,000 left in our joint checking account, the retirement fund with half its value gone, the house with a debt I never agreed to. "Tell me what to do first," I said. The first thing I did was call Susan Calloway. Patricia had advised against it. She was very clear. Don't contact the other party directly. Let the legal process handle it. Emotions are not useful right now. I understood her reasoning. I called Susan anyway, because I am 69 years old, and I have learned that there are things lawyers can't resolve, and some of them matter more than the legal ones. Susan answered on the second ring. When I told her who I was, she said, "Oh God." Just that. Just those 2 words, quietly, the way someone says something when they've been dreading a thing for a long time. "I'm not calling to threaten you," I said. "I need to know one thing. Did you know about me?" "No," she said. "Not for the first 8 years. He told me he was divorced. He had documents, Nora. He showed me a divorce decree. It looked real. I didn't find out about you until about 6 years ago, when Abby started asking about his family and I pushed him to introduce her to his children, and he couldn't keep lying. What did you do when you found out?" She was quiet for a moment. "I tried to leave him. Twice. He talked me out of it both times. Said you knew, that you had an arrangement. I wanted to believe it." Her voice cracked slightly. "I have an 11-year-old daughter who loves her father. I made choices I'm not proud of. I know that. Do you know about the money?" I asked. She didn't. I told her what was in Gerald's investment trust. The $310,000 designated in her name and Abby's name. The life insurance. She was quiet so long, I thought the call had dropped. "Then, Nora, I didn't ask him for any of that. I didn't know." A pause. "I'm looking at Abby's college fund right now, and it has $6,000 in it, because that's what I put there. Gerald said he was going to set something up. He'd take care of it. I never saw any paperwork. I never saw any of it." That was the moment I understood that Gerald had managed to wrong us both. Susan was not a villain any more than I was. She had been handed a different set of lies. We had both trusted a man who turned out to have been running 2 households like 2 separate accounts he never intended to reconcile. I told Patricia about the call the next morning. She looked at me for a moment over the top of her reading glasses. "That was inadvisable," she said. "I know. And she might be willing to cooperate on the fraud claims, if she'll attest that she never saw the investment trust documents until after Gerald died. It supports the argument that he moved assets unilaterally without either beneficiary's knowledge or consent." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she made a note. "I'll reach out to her attorney. My son threw himself into the paperwork the way I've always seen him throw himself into hard things. Head first, methodical, staying late. He built spreadsheets. He organized files. He drove to Dayton every other weekend and sat at my kitchen table going through documents while I made coffee and tried to stay useful. One evening, he looked up at me with the expression I remembered from when he was 15 and genuinely puzzled by something. Dad asked me to invest in a medical tech startup 3 years ago. Said it was going to double in 5 years. Wanted $75,000. He said I could pull from the kids' college fund. We'd make it back 3 times over. I set down my cup. Please tell me you said no. Renata said no. His wife, she said if it was such a sure thing, why did he need our money? We had a huge fight about it. I was so sure she was wrong. He shook his head. I went back to look at what that company is worth now. It went under 2 years ago. I thought about what Gerald had said to me. Don't worry about the boring financial stuff. I've got it covered. He'd said the same thing, in different words, to our son. He'd been trying to pull people into his orbit, to use their trust as a resource. Renata saved you, I said. He nodded slowly. I know that now. The handwriting expert confirmed in writing what I already knew. The signature on the home equity loan was not mine. The pen pressure was wrong. The letter formations were wrong. The signature was a reasonable imitation, but not authentic. Patricia filed the report with the court and with the lender. Patricia filed for an emergency order to freeze the investment trust, pending the outcome of the legal proceedings. The trust attorney, appointed to represent Abby's interests, cooperated, which I hadn't expected. I learned later that Susan had instructed him to cooperate fully. She and I spoke twice more before the hearing, not as friends. There were too many sharp edges between us for that, but as two women who had both been made fools of by the same person and who were, for purely practical reasons, better off working in the same direction. I need you to understand, she told me during our second call, that I'm not trying to take your house. I want Abby to be okay. That's the only thing I'm trying to protect. I know, I said, and I need you to understand that I'm not trying to take Abby's future. But that money came from my retirement, from decades of work that was supposed to be mine. I know, she said. We left it at that. I had gone back to work the month before, part-time at the public library's adult literacy program. It wasn't what I'd planned for 69. I'd planned for Gerald and I to drive to Acadia in the fall, to finally take that train trip through Colorado we'd been putting off for a decade. Instead, I was reviewing GED practice tests and trying to figure out how to make a partial Social Security check cover property taxes. The woman who ran the program was named Octavia, 63 years old, retired teacher like me, with a laugh that filled the whole room. She knew something had happened in my life. I hadn't told her the details. One afternoon, when the volunteers had all gone home, she sat across from me and said, "You don't have to tell me anything, but you look like someone carrying a thing that needs to be set down." So I told her. All of it. The phone call. The safe deposit box. There wasn't a safe deposit box in my story, but there was a folder on a desk in a lawyer's office, which amounts to the same thing. The forged signature. The 11-year-old girl. The 2 years my daughter had known and stayed quiet. Octavia listened. She didn't say the things people usually say. "I'm so sorry. How terrible. What a monster." She said, "What do you need right now?" I thought about it. "I think I need to understand how I didn't see it." "You saw what he showed you," she said simply. "That's not blindness. That's trust. The difference between a smart person and a fooled person isn't intelligence. It's access." I have thought about that sentence many times since. The hearing was in November. Patricia had prepared me for the stand, and I had prepared myself in the way I used to prepare students for exams. Quietly, thoroughly, without drama. I had read every document in that folder 3 times. I knew the dates, the amounts, the account numbers. The judge was a woman in her early 60s, silver-haired, who listened to both sides with the expression of someone who had heard a great many things and was not easily surprised. Patricia presented the handwriting analysis. She presented Gerald's phone records. She presented a sworn statement from Tom, the financial advisor, acknowledging that he had failed to notify me when Gerald changed the beneficiary designations, a failure that itself constituted a breach of fiduciary duty. She presented Susan's sworn cooperation in establishing that the investment trust had been structured without either beneficiary's knowledge. The lender's attorney tried to argue that as Gerald's spouse, I had benefited from the home equity loan. "Mrs. Fielding," he said, standing very straight, You lived in that home. You benefited from its value for 33 years. I did, I said. I also built 33 years of equity in that home alongside my husband. The loan was taken out against equity that belonged to both of us. I did not consent to it. I did not sign those papers. That signature is not mine, and your own client's documents have now been shown to contain a forgery. He moved on. The judge called a recess. We sat in the hallway on wooden benches, Patricia reviewing notes, my son pacing, me watching the light change on the floor. When we were called back, the judge looked at the room for a moment before she spoke. The evidence presented establishes clearly that Mrs. Stablish's Fielding's signature was forged on the home equity loan application. The loan was therefore obtained fraudulently, regardless of the marital status of the parties involved. The lien on the property is void. She looked at her notes. Regarding the investment trust, the court finds that assets were moved from jointly held retirement accounts into a designated trust without the knowledge or consent of the co-account holder. Under Ohio law, this constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty within the marriage. The trust is to be dissolved. The funds will be returned to the marital estate for distribution according to standard probate proceedings. My son grabbed my hand. I didn't cry. I'd done my crying earlier, in Gerald's office at 2 a.m, reading texts I was never supposed to see. By the time we got to the courthouse, something had moved past grief and into something harder and quieter. Not anger, something more like clarity. We walked out into cold November air. My son said, "Mom, you won." "I know," I said. He waited. "You don't seem happy." "I'm relieved," I corrected him. "There's a difference. What I had won was the right to keep a house I'd lived in for 33 years, and the return of retirement money I'd spent 30 years contributing to. I had not won back the 41 years I believed I understood my own life. I had not won an explanation that made sense of how a man who held babies in his medical practice and fixed our neighbor's porch steps in a rainstorm could also do this. I had not won the simple grief of losing a husband, uncomplicated. Instead, I had something knotted and strange that I was going to be untangling for the rest of my life. That evening, my daughter called. We had spoken only twice since the night she told me she'd known for 2 years. Both calls had been short, factual. The distance between us was something I was still figuring out how to cross. "I watched the news alert," she said. "The hearing. It went our way." A pause. "Mom, I need to say something." "Okay. I've been telling myself that I stayed quiet because I was protecting you, that finding out would hurt you and I was sparing you from that. But that's not true." Her voice was careful, choosing words the way you choose footing on ice. "The truth is that I was protecting myself. Because if I told you, everything would have to change, and I wasn't ready for everything to change. It was selfish, and you paid for it." I sat with that for a moment. "You were put in an impossible position by your father," I said. "He made you carry something that wasn't yours to carry, and that was wrong. I'm angry with you. I want to be honest about that. But I also know that anger isn't the whole story." "Are we going to be okay?" she asked. "Ask me again in a year," I said. "I think yes, but I need time." It was the most honest answer I had. The probate process took 7 months. The investment funds came back into the marital estate and were divided according to Ohio law, which meant, after Gerald's debts and the legal fees and the complexity of a 54-year-old man dying without an updated will, I received significantly less than the $580,000 that should have been ours. But I received enough to stop worrying about the property taxes, enough to pay off Patricia's fees, enough to breathe. Susan Calloway received nothing from the investment trust. It had been dissolved back into the marital estate. What she received was the half of the life insurance that Gerald had designated to her. The courts could not easily void a beneficiary designation in the absence of fraud that directly targeted that designation, and Gerald had not forged Susan's name, only mine. I had asked Patricia about contesting it. She'd given me her honest assessment. Possible, but expensive, uncertain, and it would require years more litigation against a woman who had already cooperated with my legal claims. I thought about Abby, 11 years old, not responsible for any of it. I told Patricia to let it go. That fall, Octavia and I started a financial literacy workshop at the library. 2 Saturdays a month, 2 hours each session. We covered the basics: how to read account statements, how credit scores work, what power of attorney means and when you should and shouldn't grant it, how to access your own credit report, what questions to ask a financial advisor. We titled it plainly, Know Your Own Money. The first session had 9 women. By the third month, we had to move to a larger room. Most of them were like me, smart, capable, educated women who had handed financial management to a spouse or parent because it seemed easier, because they were told they weren't good with numbers, because trust felt like a virtue. One woman had discovered after her husband's death that they had no retirement savings at all. He'd spent it over 15 years without telling her. Another had found, going through her father's papers, that he'd taken out a reverse mortgage on the home he'd promised her. These were not unusual stories. That was the part that surprised people most when they came in, how ordinary it all was. I shared my own story at the second session. Not everything. Some of it was still too tangled to present cleanly, but enough. The forged signature. The safe deposit box that wasn't a safe deposit box in my case, but was a lawyer's folder with the same weight, a phone call from a woman whose name I hadn't known, the moment of understanding that the person I had trusted most in the world had made decisions about my life without telling me. How did you get through it? Someone asked. I got angry, I said. And then I got practical. In that order. I still worked at the library 3 days a week. I still planted things in the rose garden, though it felt different now. Less like tending something Gerald and I had built together, and more like tending something that simply belonged to me. I'd had the back porch repainted. Not because there was anything wrong with it, but because I needed some things to change. My daughter and I were finding our way back to each other slowly. The way you navigate a room in the dark, hands out, careful, learning the new geography. She'd started seeing a therapist, partly to work through her grief over her father, partly to work through what it meant to have held that secret for 2 years. I respected that she was doing the work. My son was steady, the way he has always been steady. He and his wife were fine. Renata had been right 2 years ago, which is a fact she has never once mentioned in my presence. Abby, Gerald's daughter with Susan, turned 12 that summer. I found this out because Susan sent me a short email, not asking for anything, just letting me know. The way you might let someone know about a piece of shared history. I did not respond immediately. I sat with it for a week. Then I wrote back, "Thank you for telling me. I hope she had a good birthday." It was not forgiveness. I don't know what to call it. Something smaller than forgiveness and maybe more honest. An acknowledgement that this child existed in the world and was not responsible for the circumstances of her existence, and that the least I could do was recognize that. On what would have been our 42nd anniversary, I went to my bank, not the bank Gerald had used. I'd moved all my accounts 3 months before. A different branch, clean slate. I sat across from a young woman in her 20s, and I opened a new CD for the first time in my own name. Money I'd earned, money I knew the full history of. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" she asked. I thought about Gerald at his desk, the reading glasses, the half-eaten sandwich. I thought about 41 years and a phone that rang when I picked it up. I thought about Octavia telling me that the difference between a smart person and a fooled person is access, and how I intended to spend whatever years I had left making sure as many women as possible had access to the truth about their own financial lives. "No," I said. "I think I have everything I need." I walked out into October light, and for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly where my money was, exactly where I stood, and exactly whose name was on every account I owned. It was only mine. If any of this sounds familiar to you. The spouse who handles everything, the account you've never looked at, the voice in the back of your mind that says something feels off but you can't name what, trust that voice. Look at the accounts. Ask the questions even when it feels disloyal, even when it feels like you're accusing someone who doesn't deserve it. Because here's what I learned at 69 years old, the hard way, in a lawyer's office overlooking the Great Miami River. Love is real, and it can exist right alongside betrayal. Both things were true in my marriage, and I've had to learn to hold them both at once, which is the hardest thing I've ever done. But financial transparency is not a threat to love. It is the floor that love stands on. And if someone is keeping you off that floor, you need to ask yourself why. I did not ask. For 41 years, I did not ask. You still can. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot lately, not in the abstract way, in the specific, personal way that only comes after something has cracked your life open and forced you to look at what was inside. Gerald made choices. Each one led to the next the way water finds a path downhill, quietly, consistently, always following the easiest route. One lie became two. Two became a second life. A second life required money, and money that wasn't his to move got moved anyway, piece by piece, in small enough amounts that no single transaction looked alarming. He was a careful man. He had always been careful. What I didn't understand for 41 years was that his carefulness was serving two households, and I was only aware of one of them. That's the part I've had to sit with the longest. Not the anger, which came fast and burned hot, and was actually, in some ways, useful. The harder thing was understanding that I had handed someone else the wheel of my own financial life and called it trust. I meant it as a virtue, and maybe it was, in the way that most things we mean well are virtues until the circumstances around them change. But virtue without information isn't wisdom, it's just hope. And hope is not a financial plan. What Gerald did was wrong. I want to be clear about that without softening it. Forging my signature, moving our retirement savings, hiding a second family, these were not mistakes born of weakness. They were decisions made repeatedly over many years. He chose, every Friday afternoon for 22 years, to keep driving toward a life he'd built behind my back. The consequences of those choices landed on me, on Susan, on Abby, on our children. That's how it works. The person who makes the choices and the people who absorb the consequences are not always the same people. But here is the other side of it, and I think it matters just as much. I also made choices. I chose not to look at the accounts. I chose to accept "don't worry about it" as a complete answer. I chose year after year to stay comfortable in my ignorance, because looking would have required me to question someone I loved. Ignorance felt like peace. It was not peace. It was just a postponed reckoning. Nora, the woman I am now, not the woman I was 2 years ago, knows the difference. I know what's in every account I own. I know my credit score. I know what my Social Security payment will be, and what it covers and what it doesn't. I know these things because I learned them the hardest possible way, and because Octavia sat across from me in an empty library and asked what I needed, and because Patricia walked into a courtroom and told the truth clearly and without apology. Strength isn't the absence of being hurt. It's what you build in the space that opens up after. I was hurt. I am still, in ways I can't always name. But I am also here, in a house with my name on it, running a workshop that has helped 43 women so far understand their own money, their own credit, their own names on their own accounts. Gerald tried to erase me from my own financial life. He did not succeed. That is not because I was stronger than him. It is because, once I knew the truth, I refused to look away from it. That's all it takes, really. Not courage in the dramatic sense, just the willingness to look at what's actually there.